Hey, Mike with Nerd Problems Gaming here, and today's video will be doing a review and how to play video on Dungeons & Dragons, Dungeon Scrawlers, Heroes of Waterdeep, so let's get into it. Alright, so now that we've got the game out, I'll walk you through a bit more on how you play the game, and then I'll jump into my review after that. And so when you start the game, typically you're going to be playing through 3 dungeons at a time, and then you'll add up your final score, and the player with the highest score after 3 dungeons will win the game. But when you're just starting off, you'll likely want to start on the first dungeon. And so if you look at the dungeon tile sheets, you can actually see in the top right corner, it will have a label, D, and then a number, and that just indicates which dungeon it is. So when you start off in dungeon 1, just take the D1 card. On top of that, you want to look at the Dungeon 1 special rules. So it indicates how the scroll ends, so defeating the villain boss in the middle of the stage. It also shows you what bonuses you might get, or any special rules that are applying during this dungeon. On top of that, you want to have a character picked out. Each character has their own specific character sheet. They also have their own special abilities, and so depending on which character you choose, you'll be able to activate that ability throughout the game. So again, rogues, for example, can just draw right through treasures. Wizards can draw right through spells. Barbarians can draw right through monsters. Rangers can draw through exotic plants. And finally, the cleric can draw through numbers in any order versus having to go in numerical order. So again, decide which hero you want to play as your character and choose them for your starting hero. And you'll play as this hero throughout the rest of the game. Once you've done that, you also want to set up some items based on the dungeon that you're in. So you've got dragon coins, which are these little coins here. You want to set them up as 4 for each player in the game. So in a 2-player game, you'd set out 8. Depending on the map, you might have orbs. And how these work, you want to set them out with the first on top and then 4th being at the bottom. As you collect these throughout the dungeon, they're worth more value if you're the first person to get them. And you can collect multiples of these throughout each dungeon if they happen to be present. So you want to set out both the blue orbs and the red orbs. You also want to set out keys. There'll be colors of each type. Again, some maps have these, some maps don't. But in a 2 or 3 player game, you want to set out 2 keys. And in a 4-player game, you only want to set out 3 keys. Make sure each player has their own marker. You also want to set off to the side mini dungeons. Not every single dungeon card has those, but make sure you have them off to the side, just in case they do. You'll want to find the starting point on each map. Some maps might have multiple starting points, so be on the lookout for those, as you can decide which one you want to start at. Now again, depending on the dungeon you choose, the only way the dungeon scroll will end is when you meet the end conditions. Again, in this case, on Dungeon 1, once someone has covered up this boss monster, the scroll ends, and players will add up their points from the run. Now, a couple rules as you're going through the map. First is that when you're drawing, you need to have your pen stay on the board the entire time. So you can't lift up your pen and start drawing somewhere else. That's not allowed. It needs to maintain contact with the board. Couple other rules: when you enter a room, you need to interact with everything in that room before moving on. If you don't, you lose points. So in this room, for example, I would need to interact with the spells. How spells work is I need to trace the line for the entire spell and then move on to the next one, trace the entire line, and move on. And then I could leave to the next room. For each item I potentially ignore, I will lose victory points for each one of those items. However, if I enter a room, let's say I'm in here, I'm scribbling out a monster, I start to go on the treasure, which is outlining it, and then time runs out, I don't lose a point for not completing that monster because, again, time ran out. It's only if I have the option to complete something and I choose not to that I would lose points. Another rule is that you need to stay within the lines. So if I go here and I run into a wall and I keep going in the same corridor, that's okay. However, if I'm drawing and I go through a corridor and I keep going to the other side, that would be minus 1 point. Also, if I'm drawing and I go through a corridor and then go into another room through a wall, anything after that point that I might do isn't going to count for any points, so be careful of that. On top of that, as I'm going through, if I go in and I get a coin on the map, I can take a coin and add it to my collection. Each coin is going to be worth 1 victory point, and the player that has the most coins at the end of the game will get an additional 3 points beyond 1 for each coin. Now these are the different elements you might encounter in a dungeon. You've got monsters, spells, treasures, artifact fragments, and exotic plants. And so again, you can see this breaks down how you defeat the monsters. You just scribble out their whole image. Looking at exotic plants, you just need to draw a line through them. Spells, as I mentioned, you need to draw through the entire path. Treasures, you need to do an outline around the treasure. Numbers, you need to cover them in numerical order. And then bosses, you need to fully scribble them out completely. Another thing you might encounter are mini dungeons. So you can see here, this is an entrance point to a mini dungeon. When you enter them, what you then need to do is draw one of these mini dungeon cards. And so once you draw these mini dungeon cards, then what you'll need to do is go to the starting point, and that's where you're going to enter this mini dungeon. So again, you would draw around in the dungeon, completing the different tasks, whatever the case might be, scribbling monsters, collecting treasure. And then what happens is you will find an exit point labeled with a number. Once you do that, you're then going to come back to the main map and find an exit point matching that number. So in this example, I left from the 2 on that mini dungeon. So this is where I'm going to start drawing from when I leave that dungeon. So again, I can come out and continue my progress, trying to complete the dungeon as I go. Also, as you collect keys throughout the dungeon, you can see here, you'll see doors with the corresponding key color. If you have the corresponding key in your inventory, you can then travel through these doors like they don't exist. Orbs, like I briefly mentioned, you're going to color them completely over through the orb section of the image. And when you do that, if you're the first player to do so, you would collect that top orb worth the most points, and you would progressively move down of that color for each future orb someone decides to color through. You'll occasionally find portals. These are pretty simple. You'll draw a line into the entry point, and then you will resume drawing at the exit point at another location on the stage. Some dungeons have an escape portal. This simply makes you leave the dungeon, and if it's on a specific map, that would end the dungeon scroll. You also might encounter prisoners. These are pretty simple. All you need to do is interact with them, so just touch them with your line and you'll free them, and they're worth 1 victory point at the end of the map. One-way arrows is another option you might encounter. This just indicates which direction you have to go on a specific path. Again, as I mentioned, players will simply be racing against each other, trying to complete the maps as quick as they can while earning the most points. And then after 3 maps, players will add up their total score, and the player that has the highest score in total will be the winner of the game. But overall, that's how you play Dungeons & Dragons, Dungeon Scrawlers, Heroes of Waterdeep. There's some more detailed rules in the rulebook if you did have questions, or feel free to drop a comment on this video as well, and I can try and help if I can. But now that you have a better idea on how the game works, let's jump into my review. Well, again, now that you know a little bit more on how you play the game, how do I actually feel about it? Well, this game is actually a really cool concept that combines both dungeon crawling and a maze game while creating a race-like atmosphere all at the same time. And so I think that's a really cool concept. Certainly, I think the game is probably more geared towards a younger crowd, but I think you'll still have a good time as an adult playing this game, and is a great game to play with children or with a younger crowd and still be entertained if you're playing as an adult. And so the game really has a lot of replay value with it because there's several different characters that you can choose from and play as. On top of that, there's several different maps you can play through. In typical games, you'll be playing through 3 different rounds, so you can create almost an endless combination of maps that you want to go through in this 3-round combination. On top of that, there's the added feature of the mini maps and mini dungeons. And so throughout a variety of the map levels, you'll be able to go into different mini dungeons and you'll draw from a random pile. And again, there's a big chunk of these, and so that can create a new experience every time you go through the dungeons and draw those mini maps, which is really cool. I did play the original Dungeon Scrawlers game, Heroes of Undermountain, And so that game is very similar to this, but this really added some extra features and I think enhanced the game a lot more. Again, those mini dungeons was one example. They've added the dragon coins, which is another element that players will race for in attempts to collect the most coins. There's also new art variations of the character types, which is really cool. And just new layouts of maps as well is another great feature of this game. There's also some additional variants, which I didn't go into depth on the video, but that's another added feature throughout this game as well. I really like that the game doesn't take too long to learn. You can really get up and running and playing the game in just a few minutes, and play sessions don't last that long as well. Most game sessions playing 3 rounds only take about 15 to 20 minutes, and so it's quick to play, easy to learn, and a lot of fun, and it has a high replay value as well. I think if you're looking for a unique combination of mazes, dungeon crawling, and fantasy role-playing, this kind of fits all of those in a small, neat package, and I definitely recommend it. But if you want to pick up a copy of this game, I'll have a link in the description below. And if you like videos like this on video games, board games, and everything nerdy, be sure to check out one of our other videos here. And if you'd like to help support the channel, pick out content and more, consider becoming a patron of ours at nerdproblemsgaming.com/Patreon. And another really cool way that you can support the channel is we actually partnered with a game store, Nutmeg Games. And so if you head to nutmeggames.com/nerdproblemsgaming or use our promo code nerdproblemsgaming at checkout, you'll actually get 10% off your order and help support the channel at the same time. So if you'd like to order things like board games, Pokemon cards, Magic cards, and more, definitely check that out and take advantage of that great discount. And if you like videos like this on video games, board games, and everything nerdy, check out one of our other videos here. And if you haven't done so yet, be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell notifications to get the latest updates of new nerd videos we put out. But once again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you more soon.